Well, welcome. This is Paul Cargan. I'm here with Hal Bush to discuss his new novel. Hal has been a literary scholar of American literature for many years, published many works and books of literary scholarship. And the Hemingway Files is his first novel, emerging out of his history as a literary scholar. Hal, thanks for joining me to talk about your book.
Thanks. It's a pleasure being here. Thanks, Paul.
I wanna jump in with a passage kind of near the end, and I don't know how much we want to give away about them.
Spoilers, yeah.
No spoilers, I guess. So I won't say the context of this passage, but I think the words of it kind of get to the heart of a lot of what you're doing in this novel.
Okay.
So the character Sensei says, Whitman knew some things, and his words ennobled people. I'm on page 282. He forced us to think about what we might be in the world. Without words, the people remain powerless. Without beauty, life becomes ugly and unlivable. A brief moment passed, and then he continues, it is why some of us romantics became teachers of literature, I'm sure. Sowing in hope. Otherwise, the words are just scratches of ink on paper. So this idea about the power of words is at the heart of this novel, wouldn't you say?
I think it is. I mean, the book launches with this older professor receiving a box that says a box full of nothing but words, and the words are underneath the rocks. It's at the end, the river runs through it, you know. And of course, the word might even suggest to some readers the word, the logos, meaning the kind of unifying central logic of the created universe. See, so I think that's a wonderful passage you chose to begin with. That is a nice thematic central synopsis of some of my concerns in the book. And I think one of the interesting things I've been asked is about the way the book portrays a certain kind of life, the academic life, the teacher's life. You mentioned the phrase sowing in hope, which was the name of an old theological book about like sowing seeds of hope and all of those things. Maybe it's a little sappy or romantic for some readers, but I just have gotten a little tired. I like a lot of the academic books about novels about the academic life. David Lodge books or Richard Rousseau's book, Straight Man, or Moo, or some of those, but they're just they're very funny, but I read them and I never feel like I'm a character in them. I feel like they're just caricatures of what people think we actually do, and it doesn't resemble what I think most of us are trying to do, which is inspire people, help people, and make the world a better place, right?
I think that ties to the next question that I have for you. I thought it was counterintuitive to write a novel about like literary scholarship. I don't think most people think literary scholarship, and that's going to be a page turner. Which maybe we ought to re-question our life choices as literary scholars. But you take this thing that we've done, this way of living that is based around texts and kind of reading texts and contexts and kind of teasing out the nuance, and you add in a dose of international intrigue, and then you kind of find or create the narrative drama through the kind of the backstories of these kind of giants of American literary history. So how did you come to write a novel about books in this way?
Well, that's a great question. I'm really interested in the whole idea of collecting. So I think of the work we do as a kind of collecting. We may not be collecting specific artifacts or particular material goods, but we're collecting ideas, we're collecting quotes, we're collecting authors and books by those authors in our kind of mental libraries. But I think that, I do think that passage you read at the beginning, again, it invokes the reasons most of us got in. We got into, we love these books, we love these authors. And it's like when I went to Japan, I had never eaten sushi, but now I love sushi. So your tastes change, and you sometimes when you teach a poem or a book and your students are kind of nodding off, or it's April, they want to get out of school, but we're here, taste this, try this. This can really change your world. This can rock your world, right? And there is a power to what we teach. I want to resist that whole post-humanist trend. There's a deep irony that many people in the humanities want to resist the entire roots, the meaning and purpose of the humanities. And so again, it could be that some of my concerns seem a little bit dated or out of fashion, right? But I still, again, want to emphasize it's really important that we don't lose touch with the books, with the words that have shaped our culture, our civilization, really.
Yeah, I don't kind of myself, I don't understand why some would veer away from the idea that literature and words can matter for our lives, that the humanities can make us more human. I think certainly there's been historically there's just the whole challenge of postmodernism, which to oversimplify took all the givens that were thought to be unshakable foundations and took them into question. And so some people say, well, that with that you throw out meaning. I don't get that. I mean, that itself is meaningful, right? To know that we have to navigate more treacherous waters than we knew, and that the ground is less certain. I mean, that has incredible implications for our life and for how we have to live. So yeah, I don't understand why postmodernism or post these posts would take us away rather than take us deeper into the questions of how to live and what we.
That's a great question too, and it kind of gets a little bit beyond the parameters maybe of my book, but it's sort of foundational to my concerns. I think that we shouldn't underestimate the level of epistemological confusion of our world today. I mean, for me, that's a kind of a phrase that I wrestle with that in almost every class I teach, including graduate level, but in particular this last semester dealing with a freshman level class that I hadn't really taught in a long time. And we're now rotating in and out of that. It's kind of the it's sort of the second part of composition type rhetoric class. And our students today, they come to the university pretty much with a consensus view that all arguments are pretty much subjective and that everybody's entitled to their opinion, and who's really to say. So to me, it's like I spend 4 months in a semester just trying to get them to consider the possibility that depending on the question or depending on the argument, we need to have a better response to it than to just say, well, everyone's entitled to their opinion. So there's this default position. It has to do with tolerance. It has to do with being non-judgmental. But of course, you can see where all that leads. There's a crisis in expertise and authority. It means that actually, okay, maybe a scientist can tell us about specific gravity or about some really kind of empirical kind of argument. But when it comes to anything that has anything to do with morals or values or ethics or anything like that, who's to really say? And so this is a crisis that I think now, for a number of reasons, and technology is involved in it too. I think that I feel like, without sounding like a nervous Nelly or whining about all of these things, it could be that we're entering this period where it's increasingly likely that we can turn away from those things. You would think that that would be a logical place to go, but technologies are training us otherwise too. It's called the age of distraction for a lot of good reasons, right?
Your novel has 3 layers of narration. I wanted to ask you about. I just thought formally this was very interesting, and I think perhaps it ties into this question of epistemology, of how do you know, and how all knowing is from a perspective. You can't get outside of you're always knowing from somewhere. So the bulk of the story is told in the first person. Letters of Jack Springs, the protagonist, writing about his experiences primarily in Japan. And then these are framed by kind of the chapters before and then kind of interspersed with comments after by his mentor, Martin Dean, who has received these letters and edited them and will not quite publish them, because there's one third layer, which is the brief 1-page note to the reader, from you or from, I guess, what is a fictional version of you, claiming that this is a true story, even though I guess it says it's a novel on here somewhere. I don't think I'm really supposed to take this as a true story. So you've put yourself as a character just on 1 page, very briefly. But it seems to me that being the very first thing that we encounter in the whole novel is you framing, and then another frame, and then the narration. So we've got 3 different perspectives, mostly agree, but remind us that, hey, this is a story being told by someone.
Right.
And at least at one, well, I guess there's 2 points that there's a kind of almost a fracture between the narration. At one point we get 2 very different assessments of Ezra Pound by different narrators. So on 188, so Martin Dean says that Ezra Pound recanted many of his hideous beliefs, but privately he maintained his hateful prejudice. And then on 195, we've got I guess in Jack Springs quoting, let's see, Sensei, and says he was racked by guilt and shame. And so just that little difference between the layers reminds me, hey, this is their perspectives here.
Right.
We're getting stories. So I wonder if you might comment on that, and then I guess the other small point is where Jack Springs plays a little trick on his mentor by making him go the long way up the mountain. But that just reminds us, just that little details, that hey, this is a story. These are multiple stories layered on top of each other.
Yeah.
So why did you do that? What were you thinking?
I mean, those are there's a number of things there to comment on. I think that's very astute to talk about someone like Ezra Pound, or the much more central figure in the book, which is Hemingway. And as a person who's done biographical writing, probably I've read 100 or maybe hundreds of books about Mark Twain in particular, and knowing how Mark Twain or Hemingway or Lincoln or Whitman or Ezra Pound or Harriet Beecher Stowe, these are kind of like Rorschach tests in some ways. It's like you look at this person and tell me about your Hemingway. In fact, there's a book called Our Mark Twain, and there's another book by Howells, William Dean Howells, called My Mark Twain. And so there's a sense in which we're trying to describe these bigger than life figures, and some people love them and some people don't. In fact, there's another scene in there where Sensei is talking with Jack, and they're talking about the different kinds of approaches to Hemingway. And for example, the fact that a lot of feminist writers and scholars dislike Hemingway. And so that's kind of part of the mix when we talk about the great authors. So now let me go back to, and I'm happy to talk more about that, because I think that's important as you become immersed in the lives of, it could be authors, or it could be Lincoln, or it could be anyone who, different people have different perspectives on it. The other thing about Pound, by the way, before I leave this, you mentioned these two competing versions. And when you read them, I thought, yeah, they could both be true. Actually, they sound like they're different, or they're contradictory even. But I think that human beings can often be quite contradictory that way. So, for example, Pound could have remained a virulent anti-Semite for his entire life, and still felt some, or at least kind of, he may have vacillated on that, but he still could feel some shame about those decisions too, you know, in retrospect. I think that I could give other examples of that. Let me talk a little bit about the frame. And I've had a lot of questions about that one-page opener, okay? That's been a favorite, and it trips people up. And I've often had people say, you know, I read the first page, and it's in your voice, and you sign it at the bottom, HKB. I mean, did this really happen? So I saw that was a rather late addition to the final manuscript. That was one of the last things I did. And I think of it now as a kind of metafictional trick, in a sense. It's also a kind of sequel trick, because it may mean that when and if I write another volume in this series, it would somehow have to include maybe the last part of Martin Dean's life, and then passing the baton on to this HKB character. You know, so remember, like in Breakfast of Champions by Kurt Vonnegut, when Kilgore Trout goes up to the bar and Kurt Vonnegut is in the bar, your question's a good one to think about. Is that really Kurt Vonnegut, or is it just a character named Kurt Vonnegut? Or when Norman Mailer in Armies of the Night talks about Norman Mailer, is he really talking about himself, or is it a version of himself or a persona? And so that's a great question, but I think here's the more global answer to your question. And the multiple voices, one might think of something like Sound and the Fury, or As I Lay Dying by Faulkner, or even the new novel, Lincoln and the Bardo by George Saunders, where you get all of these different voices describing the similar events, and yet they're quite different. There's not as many voices in this novel, but it's definitely an older professor and his protege, and then to some extent Sensei, a Japanese, and there's other Japanese characters that speak. And they're kind of describing similar things. I think that one of the things that I'm trying to do, and I'm not sure how successful I am in the novel, of course, is to kind of, there's a fluid connection between history and literature. And oftentimes people think, well, even you look, I thought it said on here it's a novel. So when I teach Uncle Tom's Cabin, for example, which is a novel, I really want to impress on my students the fact that it's also a very astute and accurate historical narrative in a lot of ways. In other words, it works. Uncle Tom's Cabin works because it portrays certain slaves and certain things about slave culture and slave owners and the way people talked about slavery. It's a historical, there's a historical accuracy. Do you see what I mean? Similarly, when you look at the different Mark Twain biographies, just to take him, or the Hemingway biographies, I'm getting ready to go to Paris next month, there's going to be 600 Hemingway fanatics at the International Convention. And different people have different ways of thinking about Hemingway. It's a historical figure. We have a lot of an abundance of information and primary documents about him. And yet people disagree about all kinds of things. So that when we write biography, or when we write about the Civil War, or about Donald Trump, or whatever we write about, there's a certain fictional quality to our history. Fiction just means that it's something that was made or created. Okay, so when we talk about history, it's actually always, by definition, a fiction in terms of a certain definition. So do you understand that kind of fluidity? I want people to read the book who are Hemingway or Mark Twain or Ezra Pound experts. I want them to recognize the way I talk about those characters. I don't want them to say, that doesn't sound right. So I had to immerse myself a little bit in the Ezra Pound material, which I didn't know that much before I wrote the book. Similarly, I want people who love Japan or who have been to Japan and spent time there, I want them to go, that's just how people talk. Or I know that scene. I've been in that situation. So there has to be a kind of historical veracity, I think, at least in this kind of literary fiction, for it to be compelling to people. People need to be able to read it and say, I know this is a made-up story, but it's very plausible. Everything in it makes sense. You know? How's that?
I like that. I want to ask you, you mentioned, or something very close to a moment in the novel I liked quite a bit. So Jack Springs is describing his romantic interest, Mika, and he pauses and has a moment of I guess meta commentary, self-awareness. He says, yes, perhaps the feminist critics that are my friends from school would have some objections to the way that I'm describing this character, and they'd be right. And I chuckled out loud. In some ways that echoes what we've been talking about, right? He's aware of multiple perspectives, even on his own perspective.
Yeah, that's true.
But that got me thinking. So it's clear that the novel is self-aware in terms of gender representations. I wonder, and I think certainly the answer is yes, but I want you to talk some about it. How you thought about the obstacles of writing cross-culturally to kind of represent a culture fairly. You just talked about wanting it to be, to have this historical veracity to it, to avoid stereotypes and exoticize the other, or exoticizing the foreign. So if you can imagine what, or if the character can imagine what feminist critics would say, for instance, we might develop that question. What do you imagine post-colonial critics might say about the novel? And there are just a couple passages I want to refer to answer that. So early on 82, Martin Dean is commenting on the chapter. He says, he mentions Jack's idea of Japan, and he puts that in quotation marks. I think that is really important idea, that what we're getting isn't Japan, as we're getting a character's idea of Japan, or multiple characters. And this is an idea that develops late in the novel. He mentions this anger at Japan. And then at one point, I think a really key 152, another key passage that speaks to this, and it's again Martin Dean commenting on Jack's chapter. He says, "We collect, that is, at least we tell ourselves so, for the purpose of renewal, first to know the other in more precise detail." So certainly this novel is thinking about how do you engage with a culture that is not your own.
Yeah.
And so I want to hear, maybe out of all of those things I just mentioned, some of your thinking about you what it meant as not Japanese to be writing a novel so much about Japan.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that the first thing I would say is, of course, and I hope you pick up on it. I hope the readers pick up on it. I love Japan. Okay, so I want to somehow communicate. There's an early passage where he wants to go, and his mentor says something to the effect of, well, he has a job offer in Kansas, and so there's a remark about going from the Wizard of Oz. I don't remember exactly. I'd have to look it up. But are you ready to kind of go off to Oz, right? And there's a kind of a wonderment. I remember when I first went to Japan and I walked around Tokyo and I was in Shinjuku, one of the kind of Times Square areas. Just the spectacle of being in this place for a kid from Indiana. So Jack's not me, but Jack has some certain similarities to being, he's from Indianapolis. He calls himself a corn pusher from the Midwest, that kind of thing. And to go, and then there's the other thing that's kind of part of all this is there's a few discussions in the novel about World War II and the fact that the Japanese were our enemies, our tremendous enemies. They attacked Pearl Harbor. My father was in the U.S. Army Air Corps. And so, I mean, there's still, it's just an amazing thing that here they are 40 years later sitting across the table from each other, talking about that. So there may be a little bit of a love-hate relationship with Japan in the novel, but I think it's mostly a love relationship. I think that it's interesting that you bring up there is a self-awareness at times in the novel about the feminist perspective and how maybe feminists or other critics don't like Hemingway for being so, machismo and all that kind of thing. And then you ask, well, what about post-colonial critics? What would they say? That strikes me as a very English professor kind of question to ask. And I applaud you for that. It is something I've thought a little about, but mostly I think in the context of my time in Japan, and whether you know it or not, my wife is Japanese and we've been together almost 30 years. I've spent a lot of time there with her family. And even within Japan, there are cultural differences from the North and South, the urban and the rural. So one thing that probably we have to be a little careful about is that we don't think that there's a particular Japanese view or here are the way Japanese are. It changes from place to place within Japan, or even within the city of Tokyo, which is just immense. But I think that I don't personally mind if you read it or some reader would say, well, there's a certain exoticism, because of course there is. I mean, we may wish it away, or we may think, oh, that's so colonial, or that's so, offensive. And it's like, but that's exactly how it struck me when I first went. It was exotic. It was other. It was different. It took me a long time. It took me about a year, actually. My first year, I thought I understood the body language and the signals, and now I look back and I just laugh at it. I totally misunderstood certain major body language signals, for example. And those are just learned behaviors. It's very different from the way Americans interact with each other and even answer questions. I can give you examples of that, but there's many examples of it in the novel.
That's helpful. Yeah, I appreciate your comment that of course it's exotic, not in the sense that it should be, but that of course it is. That's what happens when one person encounters somebody who is different from them, a culture that's different from them.
Yeah.
So how do you explore that? I mean, because the other option would be just to not encounter the other.
And see it as the beauty. I mean, there's a lot of that. I'm not ashamed of that at all. I think that that's what's so mesmerizing. I mean, think of that very strange yet oddly beautiful film, The Shape of Water. In some ways, is a kind of caricature. I don't know if you know that film, but it's about this kind of creature that is being held in this government facility, and of course, the government and the science is bad, bad, bad. But there's this one young woman, a janitor, who kind of falls in love with the creature. Is able to see the beauty of the other. I mean, certainly Japan is not grotesque in the same way that that creature is, but you know, it's a kind of a metaphor, right? How do we see the beauty and the goodness inherent in any culture that's different from ours? This is obviously a major failure of certain sectors of our society today, those that need not be named, right?
I think that's these are important questions. I teach one of the courses I teach is world literature, and I have a handout while we work through its potential pitfalls in intercultural reading, and one is othering, right? This idea that you're going to just make someone who's different completely different, categorically different, and another is saming, right? To just say we're all the same. Well, we actually do have differences.
Yeah.
And I'm very careful not to give the students this handout until halfway through the semester or later, because I mean we have to have some grace. Like I don't want to give them here are all the pitfalls before we've even begun the journey, and then they won't even want to take the journey. So I think certainly you said it took a year for you to start learning body language. I think that's an important thing to recognize, that kind of engaging cultures and understanding cultures. It's not a one time. You got to get it right the first time. It's a journey. I wanna ask you about religion in the novel. It comes up not very overtly. I wouldn't say that it's an explicit major theme of the novel, but there are little moments, and our training as literary scholars teaches us to pay attention to little moments where it kind of breaks through. So early on, Martin Dean refers to the religion of great literature. Mm-hmm. Jack's sections begins with an epigraph from St. Paul, "You are my letters," and that passage. Almost the very last words of the novel are a quotation from the New Testament. There are references to Hopkins' poem "God's Grandeur." Sensei refers to books and religion or books as his religion, and gods, writers as his gods. And so when I notice all of these little moments, and then I take that into account on the acknowledgements page, you speak very briefly about your personal faith, and then I take that into account in the context that I met you in an organization for Christianity and literature. And so that makes me suspect that religion and religious faith and belief and spirituality, that these are more important in the novel than they might seem on the surface. So I wonder if you would confirm that, or you talk a little bit about that. What's the role for you of faith in this novel?
That's a great question too. I think that I think it's very important. I think it's probably, I tried to make it pretty understated in a lot of ways. I wanted it to be kind of worked into the fabric of the novel in very subtle ways. Some are not so subtle. I mean, the religion of great books, or the sharing, or if Sensei, who's not at all in any sense some kind of Western Christian, or even perhaps religious in that traditional sense, maybe in a kind of Japanese sense. But, you know, what is religion? So part of it is this expanding and fluid idea of where are the boundaries between religion and spirituality? Where does one kind of cross over into the other? A good example of that is something like the idea of beauty. And so when I do spirituality and lit courses, I almost always at the beginning, in the first week or two, talk about the Platonic triad, which is truth, beauty, and good. And it takes it totally out of the context of biblical religion, and just talking about what are the things that all humans value, or perhaps if we want to get in a modernist mode, what are the things that all humans should value? One of them is beauty. Now, a student can say, well, you know, beauty is important to you. It's not to me. And again, I would say, well, it could be that you'll grow out of that view and grow into the view that beauty is important. That happens. But beauty is an aspect of God. That's an important part of the Christian tradition. And so when we talk about beauty, I guess I would say that what it does is it allows us to talk about God without talking about God. When we talk about truth, or what is truth, or goodness, or those kinds of aspects of God, in some ways we're talking about God in a way that almost every person can relate to. I think Gilead is one of the novels of the last 20 or 30 years that largely succeeds at that, and mostly it's in the passages where Marilyn Robinson, the author, doesn't actually talk about theology. There's a lot of theology in that book, and usually that's the places where most of my students kind of begin to fall asleep or move away. It's more in the places where they baptize the cat, or where a young couple, the guy reaches up to the tree and shakes it after a rain, and all the sprinkles come down, and they laugh. Oh. You know, it's a moment of beauty. It reminds us of the little tiny things in life that make us in touch with the possibility of transcendence. And so those kinds of things, I think, isn't that one of the reasons we read Hemingway, for example? In Big Two-Hearted River, we go to the river. He makes the camp. He looks at the grasshoppers. He scans the river, and he holds those beautiful fish in his hand, and he looks at them, right? It's like The Ending of the Road by Cormac McCarthy, where he looks at the vermiculate patterns. It's almost like a map, or is it a map or a maze? It's the last passage of the book in a 200 pages of just remorseless horror and ugliness. It ends on this moment of beauty. It's quite remarkable, actually. So is that kind of beginning to answer your question, or think about, I don't want to bang people over the head with a Bible. That's not what I think art is about.
Yeah, that's a great answer. I love all of what you just said. Yeah, you said beauty in the Christian tradition is an aspect of God. So therefore, if we're talking about beauty, we're talking about God without talking about God. And I think particularly in this historical moment, it's important to talk about God without talking about God, because God as a concept, right, versus God as a reality, has been abused and often made something very ugly. And so if we start talking about God in some contexts, we're actually not talking about God. We're talking about history of abuses. But if we're talking about beauty, I like that. Which is not to say I'm not also interested in talking about God. But I like this broadening that you're talking about, this understatement. I have one or two more things I wanted to ask you about, but I thought, is there anything you want to ask me about as a reader of your novel? I mean, you don't have to have anything. I didn't ask you to come with questions.
That's an interesting question too. Well, I'll make a comment, and then you can. This comes up a lot when I do readings or interviews or things. But one of the things that sometimes people ask about is the characters and their voices. And some people like the voice, or they don't like the voice, or they like Jack's voice but not Martin's voice, or vice versa. And sometimes when I talk about voice, of course, that's a big topic for any kind of writing with my students, undergraduate, graduate, people I'm helping. Think about your voice and think about the style and all of those kinds of things. So in my earlier draft version, a couple of readers actually, but my agent, who helped me edit and so forth, and she said, I like the two narrators, but they sound the same. And so what I did, one of the things I did was I thought about, well, I think Jack is probably the one that is closest to the way I would talk about some of these things. So I have to maybe change Martin. And so, of course, he's older. He should sound quite different in some ways, I suppose. So what I did was I got a bunch of tales by Henry James and started reading them and thinking about the syntax and the style and the way he speaks. And I actually changed quite a lot the way Martin speaks, but I'm not sure how successful that was. And then the other thing I did, and you mentioned earlier about, I have these sort of, I think of them as inner chapters between Jack's story, and then Martin comes in and it's in italics, and he does these sometimes a little frumpy, a little bit like, okay, let me explain to the reader what's going on here, or let me analyze it, like he's doing his critical analysis throughout the book, which I'm not sure if readers caught that or if they thought it was working or not. But the more I did it, the more I liked it, because it was really exactly the way a reader might respond as they're reading it. So I'm not sure if I'm formulating a question here, but maybe if you had any idea about, did you like those voices? Did you notice those differences? Did it work in a way that was useful to the novel, or was it somehow getting in the way of the novel? Yeah, something like that.
Yeah, well, I did like it. Yeah, I think it is. It's hard to imagine the novel without it, without these voices in dialogue. And I found myself, reading quickly to get to Martin Dean's. All right, here's what Jack said. I wonder what Martin has to say about that.
Yeah, okay,
I
good.
did enjoy it. And it's interesting that you're talking about the different voices. I definitely can get that. And then you had to take on the voices of like Ezra Pound and Hemingway when you included some letters of theirs.
Yeah, Ezra Pound I think was really the hardest. And there's, spoiler alert, I don't want to give away, but there's a scene where Sensei encounters him near the end of his life, and there's several things going on there. It's a major plot twist. One of my side hobbies, one of the hardest things I ever did, but it was editing the Mark Twain letters. And so in some ways I felt a lot more secure about writing in a way that sounded like Mark Twain. With Ezra Pound, it was a little bit more dicey. But you're right. When you kind of try and recreate or conjure the way people think or talk or write a letter, it's challenging. It's like I used to be in a cover band, and we would, and still sometimes, you know, I pick up a guitar and I play Wild World by Cat Stevens, or I play a Paul Simon song, Simon and Garfunkel. And you know, when you do cover bands, you can do it in your own style, but a lot of cover bands, they want to actually mimic the song itself. So you actually work at sounding like Cat Stevens, for example. And that's what I tried to recreate when I write a letter in the book, for example, by Mark Twain. I want Twain scholars even. And I've had Twain scholars contact me and say, man, I was really blown away by those letters. It sounds just like Mark Twain. You know? So that's I like that.
On one level, that just sounds fun. On another level, I think it ties into these larger thematic things we've been talking about multiple voices and multiple layers, and multiple perspectives, and this idea of knowing the other. So you are imagining someone else when you speak in their voice, and I particularly appreciate with like those letters and those passages where you're imagining someone historically real, that it's an imagination rooted in a long experience. So it's an informed imagination, and I guess that's it.
I hope it is.
So maybe may we do that? You know, if we, I'm just thinking. You know, you mentioned earlier all sorts of, you know, current things in the U.S. and around the world where if we were able to have a more informed imagination of those situations, what a different outcome we could have. I mean, how would our border policies differ if we had an informed imagination of what it might be like to be a refugee from Central America? That might not give us the answers, but certainly we'd approach the whole thing different.
Well, no, they had one of the shows, I think it was last night, because I went to a meeting last night with some people. We were talking about that. But I think it was yesterday afternoon, they had an interview with this woman from Guatemala with her like teenage son who had been threatened by a gang and they were going to kill him. And she was weeping and telling her story. And I just thought, you know, all of this stuff about the abstract laws and who's right and who's wrong, if people would just listen to this woman with her son and these idiots who say all these children are just acting, or they're, you know, it's really, if we don't have that very human connection with people's voices, like you say, and hear them, hear what they're saying, that's the root of compassion. That's where, I mean, the amazing thing, you know, people after 9/11, and they talk about Arabs and Muslims in a certain way. And my wife and I, who our marriage in some ways represents everything that people were fighting against in World War II. So we want to remind people, you know, we fell in love. I went to Japan. I fell in love with Japan. She went to college at UCLA. She came to America. Our worst enemies have become some of our best friends in the world. And why couldn't that happen with Muslims or Arabs or people in North Korea or people in anywhere, right? It begins with that process of hearing the voices and building that compassion, right?
That's beautiful. I think that is perhaps a good note to end on. This idea of literature as training for being more human, being more humane.
That's why it's not post-humanities. It is. That's what the humanities is about, Paul. It's about, and people might not like to hear this, but it's about trying to help foster and create better people. This is where our colleagues all go, well, who's to say what's better? Okay, so I say Plato, people, you know, who recognize beauty or goodness or truth or whatever. But that's, I think, what we're sowing those seeds of hope for.
Well, Hal, thank you so much for your novel and for your time and your this conversation. I've been enriched. I've enjoyed it. I hope you've enjoyed talking with me about it.
I appreciate you inviting me and for taking the book seriously and reading it the way you did. I appreciate that, Paul.
All right. Well, thank you so much.
All right, man. Take care.